Hi everybody, it's Mark here from Spectre, and welcome to our presentation and webinar on protecting the meat industry from cybercrime. The genesis of this conversation came from a discussion we had with David McMahon in Emidex, and he was in conversations we were having with him about cybersecurity and just IT in general. He said that there was a nervousness out there among the industry regarding cybercrime, and in particular around ransomware. Obviously, with the JBS hit last year in the States, which was a huge big ransomware infection over there, followed by anecdotally incidents that have happened both in Ireland and England and around Europe in the interim, we thought we'd put together this presentation. So on the call today, we have me. I'm the CEO of Spectre. We're a managed services provider based in Dublin. And we have clients spanning the UK and Ireland. So we have a UK office and an Irish office. And on the call with us today, we have Ben Jenkins from ThreatLocker, who are a zero trust application provider, who we've come across probably in the last year, and we've been working with quite in a very in-depth way in the last couple of months, helping protect clients there. So Ben will be talking about zero trust. And we also have David Cox he's an Azure team lead from Westcoast, and quite a very common question we get when we're talking to clients, and particularly when we're talking to clients in manufacturing, and other questions that come from Dave's cabal in Emidex, is people really looking to get into the cloud, or maybe trying to mitigate their risk of cybersecurity by moving to the cloud. And we've got Dave on board here today to kind of talk about the planning processes around that and make sure that that's a success. So what we're going to cover is really from a top level, from a balcony view, what this kind of the key cybersecurity challenges are today. And what I would say about this is we're not going to go in depth into all the different layers and all the different types of threats. We're just going to take a kind of an outsider's view, just on two key things that we see out there at the moment. And then we're going to look at why meat processors are a target in particular. Now, there's not a huge amount of information out there specifically on your industry. But what there is a huge amount of information on cybersecurity around the manufacturing industry and what's changing within that, and why manufacturers in particular are becoming a target. And I think some of those kind of findings are very key to you guys and your businesses. We'll then move into what it is that businesses should be doing to protect yourselves. And we're really looking at kind of how to build a system to manage cybersecurity and cybersecurity risk. And it's not just a case of technology here, it's a case of planning, it's a case of process, procedure, and building a kind of a system around it. And the takeaways from today, there's just two principles really. I mean, one, zero trust, and that the principle of zero trust, I'll let Ben explain to you later on really what that's about. And also cloud, that's Dave's kind of expertise. But what I really wanted to get at is today, if you're a senior decision maker or whatever kind of part of the organization you fit into, zero trust should be a part of the discussion always when we're talking about security. And it's about giving people least privileged access to whatever resources they need access to. And by approaching security from that perspective, you have an awful lot less to worry about in terms of the tools that you employ. So we'll come to that later on. And the second piece is around cloud. And it is is cloud the answer to some or all of your problems? And we would say yes, but, and I'll let Dave explain in more detail what that's going to be about. So just starting off, I think what we're seeing as a key challenge at the moment is that the risks out there, the entire risk landscape has multiplied, by exponentially, right? It's not doubled, it's not tripled. If we take ransomware alone, the reality of ransomware is it's probably come up 800% in the last 2 years since the initial stages of COVID. That's because of remote working and all that kind of stuff. But there's another driver behind it. And the driver really is that ransomware has gone from being a kind of an automated bot type approach to infecting people's machines. It's such big business now, it's such an enormous big kind of industry, if you want, that it's now being driven by human beings, and with humans behind that automation, it's much, much more successful. So you've got tag teams of people working together. You know, people penetrating your initial organization, people then handing that over to another team to elevate privileges within your organization, and another team that will then steal your data and your intellectual property, or seek that information out and then try and steal it, which it comes to the exfiltration piece on the far side. So it's completely changed, you know. And the other thing we see is that poorly configured technology. This is a huge topic for us. So like, this starts with everything from weak passwords and having weak password policies, to open firewall ports, to unpatched machines. These are the things that most people be familiar with. But another challenge, I think, for the meat industry these days, and wider manufacture, is that traditionally you would have had a very siloed approach to technology management. You would have had everything within the confines of your building. But now with the the IoT and different methodologies of kind of introducing efficiencies into your production lines, you've got different suppliers and different players, and every different supplier and player you bring into your business is another point of weakness, and it's another point of weakness that you have to validate. And we've also got cloud on top of that as well, so people are kind of running towards the cloud, and rightfully so in many cases. But if you're going to make that journey, you need to do it with security in mind, and you need to understand what it's going to look like when you get there. So if you think about it, the risks are out of control in comparison to, let's say, 5, 6, 10 years ago. But the investment has largely remained static. So we see a lot of clients, or potential clients, who are there kind of whose investment in cybersecurity, or even the thinking around cybersecurity, is roughly on par with what it was 3 years ago. It might be marginally up, but it's nowhere near like the multiplier effect of the risk that's out there. So I think one of the challenges is actually looking at your investment and really understanding where to apply that investment. Now I'll hand over here to Dave to talk about the human element of risk.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning, everybody. I think one of the challenges I think we all find is that you can't eliminate human error. It doesn't matter what business unit or what people are doing. Therefore, there's a couple of things that we can do. So education's important, users, administrators, and people in the business. But also, I think the other thing that we then want to be looking at on top of that would be around access and how we're managing estates, and also how we're assessing issues. So there are certain parts of the Microsoft stack, things like tools like Azure Monitor and Microsoft Secure Score rating, where you can run these to get sort of a higher level view of where weaknesses are before assigning budget to those areas and actually investing in technology. Because, let's face it, there's an awful lot of Microsoft products, even just under that sort of security umbrella, and add-on SKUs to 365, and it can be quite a confusing conversation. But this would allow you to be methodical. You can run some of these tools, things like Azure Sentinel. You can point that towards on-premise resources as well. So even before taking that step and that jump into the cloud, that's something many of you haven't looked at yet. You can actually then identify areas of focus and what you need to be looking at.
So Dave, what you're saying really is these are the tools that we use as kind of practitioners, aren't they? This is what we use to identify the risks. So, there's a whole host of really wonderful tools available to you within, that's it, is your platform for a start. But also, I think we bring it back to the simple point that almost 90% of ransomware starts with human error, right? And as Dave says, education is critical, absolutely critical. Cybersecurity education is critical. Phish testing is critical. All these things are critical. But, but what Dave is saying, which I think is really important, is assessing that situation first and understanding where those risks are. So if you don't have multi-factor authentication, I think we can all say that the party is over.
Yeah, it's a good point, because, you'll find, say one thing about Microsoft, they know how to market. So if you start looking at security and products, suddenly you're in an ocean of several products, and I suppose it, arguably they might like people to think they need all of them, but it's not necessarily the case. And sometimes a little done with intention is going to go a lot further than because one thing with a lot of these products is it's not out of the tin. You don't just place the PO and you've got advanced threat protection on your resources and you're fine. No, that there's work to be done to configure and looking at user policy and stuff. And of course that's where Mark and his team come in, but equally they can only act on the information and the reflection that you can do as a business. So it's definitely a key part, I think, of that, an ongoing dialogue. And like you said, Mark, us identifying some of those tools that there aren't going to be a cost to the business, but that you can have running to give you a clearer picture of where you need to invest. I think that's always a pretty damn good starting point for businesses.
Yeah, it's a critical starting point. I think the wider picture is that the human element is a critical piece, both from an assessment perspective and a training perspective. But next, I think what we'll do is we'll jump on to how ransomware actually comes about. And I think what we'll do is we'll hand over to Ben here on the next slide, and we'll give him a chance to explain to us how, let's say, a ransomware attack comes about. So Danny, can you move that forward?
Perfect. Thank you. So, hi guys, my name's Ben. I'm one of our senior solutions engineers here at ThreatLocker. How does a ransomware attack actually happen? Because ransomware's been in the news. I've been talking about it for the last 6 years now or so, and it's been something that's been in the news frequently. You hear about it at minimum every month, if not every week, if you're not specifically paying attention to IT news. And it seems to be a pretty inescapable thing. It's kind of at this point of everyone is going to be hit with ransomware, and sadly that is true. So the problem we get though is that we just kind of talk about ransomware as this thing that just happens, but people don't necessarily understand, well, how does it happen? The first piece is actually the executable, the malware or hacker threat actor getting access to your machine. And this can be done in a multitude of different ways. It can be done through credential attacks, whether it be spoofing of some kind, trying to guess your username and password using brute force attacks, that kind of thing. One of the most common ways that we actually see it now is by using tools that already exist on your machine. So for any of the techies who are on the call here today, check out something called the LOLBAS project, LOLBAS. It stands for Living Off the Land Binaries and Scripts. Essentially what it does is it's showing you how all the tools you've got built into your Windows operating system can be used to harm your Windows operating system. And this is what we're seeing these threat actors using day in, day out, whether it be things like PowerShell, like RunDLL, like Command Prompt, to be able to download ransomware from the internet and install it on certain machines. So from that first piece of entering the environment, they're using what already exists on machines. We're gone the days of the early 2010s when they had to install their own pieces of software. It's now, well, it's they can use whatever is there. It's pretty terrifying how easy that is. Once they've managed to get that onto the machine, and it could be that they're using PowerShell or Command Prompt, it could be that a user has clicked on an email link, and then that link has kicked off a PowerShell script to download ransomware down locally. It's very easy to be able to get a program set up on a machine. From there, that program is then kicked off. It's then running, that executable then goes ahead and runs. It generally does two things. And then we're in the middle of our screen here, the traverse and spread. So the first and the most common thing that people expect when it comes to ransomware is that it installs malware and starts to go ahead to encrypt your data, moving over into that third piece. The problem is here, it's also doing something else. It's trying to steal those credentials. It's trying to make sure that it can access everything that it needs to so that, frankly, it can go ahead and infect the most amount of data. That's where we move into our third piece, the execution. It's going to go ahead, it encrypts all of your local data, but different versions of malware, ransomware will do different things. The most common ways in which we've actually seen it recently is they will go ahead and first and foremost scan for any CIFS, NFS, or SMB shares, your network shares that you've got set up. It'll encrypt any data there. It will look for your backup locations and encrypt your backup data. Because it knows if it can encrypt all of that data, you're more likely to pay. And then the most terrifying bit, something that we don't ever talk about really in the news, is now the the exfiltration of data. And it was something that I didn't really realize until a couple of years ago, until we were kind of really looking into this. Malware has gone from like 2014, when it was CryptoLocker v3 was one of the most prevalent ones out there, infecting over like 300,000 different machines. It was insane. And all it did was it encrypted your data, and you could decrypt it, get your money, get your data back. Now what they're doing is they're actually stealing your data as well. So 77% of ransomware attacks that happen in the world actually have a threat to leak data. If we take into account the Irish Health Service attack that happened in May, I think it was, or March of this year, the Irish Health Service were threatened that it will leak public data. So this is something that is happening out there as well, and we need to be looking at it not just from the how do we stop the execution, how do we stop the encryption of data, but how do I go ahead and stop data leaks from happening as well.
Yeah, so now we're all thoroughly terrified, and in some way rightly so. And I think that's a large part of the presentation we're trying to get to today. Is like, I think what Ben is saying is like, there was a slightly fatal start to what he said, which is that we're all going to get infected. But the reality is that hackers are moving around inside people's systems today. They don't even know about it. And what we're trying to get to, when we talk about zero trust, and as we go through this today, we're going to be talking about, okay, let's just assume that they are in. Let's make the assumption that they're in there already. And what do we do once they're in? So how do we, using, let's say, SIM tools, or using the likes of what ThreatLocker does, how do we kind of slow down that progress so we can get ahead of them and lock them out and figure out how they got in to begin with, if that is the case? So Danny, can we move on? We'll start talking about remediation, and we'll start talking about the steps that we would take to move this through, more or less. So,
in the space.
Just coming back to what it is that we should be doing here. In our practice, the way we approach these things is kind of 3 stages. The first is to assess your situation. The second is to lay down the security and the lockout. And the third part of it is to set about an improvement program in order to stay ahead of that risk. To not only to address the risk that you have in front of you, but also to keep it that way. Because it's pretty obvious that things have changed a huge amount over the last couple of years, and that will continue to be the case. So when we assess, we generally select a risk standard or a profile or a framework. So if you're a low maturity company, if you've never done a vulnerability assessment, or if you don't really have an understanding of how to approach cybersecurity risk, and you're not really quite sure how to go about it, you can start with a standard or a low end framework, something like Cyber Essentials, which is very entry level, created by the UK government back in 2011 to improve the cybersecurity posture of small companies that were tendering for government work. Now, that's a very, very simple thing to achieve, but it's a great place to start as well, and would mitigate maybe 80 to 85% of modern risk today. But you could also go further. And what we have later is we have the NIST cybersecurity framework, which we use an awful lot in our practice. And it's really easy to communicate that at a board level or at a senior management level. And you could go further again, and you could go to something like ISO 27001. But really what you want to do is you want to choose something that you can score against. So it's really difficult to communicate a risk management program without a scorecard. Otherwise, it's just hundreds of lines of potential risks and vulnerabilities that you need to discuss. So choosing that framework would be the first stage. Once you've got it chosen, the next obvious step was obvious to us, but maybe not to everybody, is that you would identify all of your assets. And that would be everything to the PCs and the servers and the systems that you have, but it's also the data that you have and the sensitivity and the confidentiality of that data. It also looks at suppliers and what are the suppliers are in your environment. What are the cloud suppliers do you link to? And you look at the threats and vulnerabilities around all of those assets. And that helps you develop a security profile, your current security profile. So by understanding what assets you have and what the risks are with those assets, you can say, okay, today I look like this, and maybe my score today is 40%, and I want it to be an 80. Well, in order to get from 40 to 80, you define what good looks like by defining your target profile, which is your fourth item down there. Once that's done, the difference between 3 and 4 is called a gap. It's called a gap analysis. And that defines what the roadmap looks like. So generally speaking, when you're talking about risk and you're talking about cybersecurity, the roadmap starts with the most critical risks first. So if you've got really gaping holes in your posture or in your cybersecurity profile, so let's just say, for instance, you've no backup on your servers. Now, I know that's a crazy thing. Everyone would have backups, but maybe you don't have a testing methodology around those backups. That would be a risk to be. So it's not only that you have a backup, so that you can verify that it works. So starting with that assessment piece, defining which framework you're going to use, and then the whole roadmap out is the first stage. Once you understand what it is that you're trying to protect, then you can start the lockdown. And when we communicate lockdown to our clients, we say it's through the people, process, and technology. We call it PPT. We use these headings, right? So people, train your people, develop a culture of reporting. So if somebody messes up, that they don't hide the fact that they've messed up, that they communicate it with you. Define key roles and responsibilities. Another critical thing here about people is that when you have assets, you need to assign ownership to those assets. Somebody has to be responsible, because if nobody is responsible, you can understand what comes next. Process is critical as well. So that's what we're talking about: policies, processes, and procedures. Like I say, simple things. You need to be able to define, like, how often do my backups need to run in order to meet my recovery targets? What does my password policy look like? What does a third-party internet or third-party connection from a supplier look like into my environment? How do I control that? So all these things fall under the process heading. And the final piece is technology. So that's just ensuring that you've got good segregation and the correct layers are in place. But what we often see is that technology is the bit that's used first. So in other words, people kind of go, okay, I've got a problem, I've got a cybersecurity issue, but I have no plan. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stick a whole load of products on top of it and hope the problem goes away. And I've worked with companies, from small companies with 10 staff right up to multinationals, and I've seen and everything in between, but I've seen large companies invest hundreds of thousands of euros in cybersecurity technologies, more than that, but in the wrong order, without an understanding of what the risk was first. So understanding the risk first of all, the first part, the assessment, followed by this lockdown, is important. The last piece of it is improvement. And I can't stress how important scorecards and KPIs are here, in particular scorecards. If you don't have a scorecard or some means of communicating progress to your board or to your senior management, you're not going to get investment. It just won't happen. Or they'll give you a burst of investment to begin with that will just quickly slide away. And the investment needs to be consistent and steady. So what you see below us here is an example of a NIST cybersecurity top-level scorecard. And in NIST, there's 5 functional areas from identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, which are quite simple to explain to your board. Say, okay, identify is just identification of our assets and of the elements of the business that around cybersecurity and technology. The protection piece kind of speaks for itself. Detection is kind of the early warning systems and seeing when people are actually potentially intruders are in your place. So investing into that. Response, that's more around like what happens if we have an incident. And who do I respond to? Who's on our team? Who's on our incident response team? Do I have to talk to lawyers? Do I have to talk to an insurer? Like, what's the plan of action here? And recovery is like backup, disaster recovery, and business continuity. But this score that you see here is actually a live score taken from an environment that we worked in only a couple of weeks ago. And you can see that the identified score is very low. And the reality of it in a situation like that is they haven't got a full idea where their assets are, which means that pretty much the rest of it is a bit wobbly after that, But if you are communicating this to let's say internally, or to a board, or to someone who needs to invest in cybersecurity, you'd be saying like that's 63% total now. We need to see that up about around 80. And the first place we need to focus our attention is where our scores are weakest. So just in summary here, in terms of how you build a program of managing cyber risk, is assess first, lock down, and then set about an improvement program and make sure that this is communicated at the highest level in the organization. What I'll do is I'll hand back here to Ben to talk about zero trust cybersecurity and why should you care. But Ben, I'll let you talk about zero trust and least privilege.
Perfect. Thank you. So essentially, zero trust is the idea that we should really only be allowing minimal access to users and applications across our entire network. And we can do this by doing some really simple things. Denying access to applications that are not pre-approved, giving users least privilege. Why do we need users to have full local admin credentials? We can take that away, and we're taking away the risk. A lot of zero trust is essentially about minimizing that attack vector that threat actors are able to use to be able to get into your network. And if we can, by default, deny anything that's not essential to work, we're essentially minimizing that attack vector. So I guess to sum up that slide, zero trust security essentially blocks everything by default and then follows a least privilege model. Now, this is where I like to introduce this idea of a security triangle. At this minute in time, we look at security as a bit of a layered approach. Multiple threat scanning tools, all likely picking up the same threats because it's the same threat that will go through your web email, into your application, into your endpoint, etc. Now, why do we need bringing up the same security tool when I'm not gaining any extra security? I'm paying more for more solutions, and it's picking up the same threat at 3 different points. I'm not actually gaining any extra security there. And this is why we kind of break it down. Rather than these layers, we look at them in 3 individual angles. So the first and foremost is, we've already spoken about it today, that human layer, right down the bottom. That's training. That's, Doris in accounting, please don't go ahead and click on that link and, asking her really nicely not to. But at the end of the day, we all know what Doris is like, and Doris is going to click on that link. It's just who she is. So then we go over to our detection layer. And that's where most people tend to stack a lot of security tools on top of each other, to be honest. This is where your AV tools sit, your EDRs, your MDRs, and all of the rest. And this is where we tend to see that kind of lack of extra protection that's coming in. All the detection piece is doing is telling you that, hey, we think there's a problem here, and then you need to take some kind of way to solve this. And that's where we like to focus primarily over on the right-hand side, our controls piece. So, does anyone know the most easy way to stop a phishing attack, for example? It's not by reading emails, not by clicking on the link at the top and make sure it's safe. The easiest way is actually dual-factor authentication or two-factor authentication. My dad has an engineering firm, and I was walking to the pub with him a month back, and he explained he'd been part of a phishing attack. His company had been hit with a phishing attack. His finance person had seen an email that had come through. It looked like it was from him, and she then sent 20 grand to another bank account. Now, if they had the control in place of dual-factor authentication, that would not have happened. Now he has it, he has learned his lesson, and he is very much on board with that now. But these are the kind of powers of having this control piece. There was nothing detection could have done at that point. There was nothing, well, human training would have been much better. There was nothing from a detection side. This is where the controls come in as well, and that's where people are lacking.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we see in our practice is that we see a lot of the tools on the left-hand side of the pane there are about reacting to a situation once it's begun. So a ransomware solution will kick in once the ransomware actually starts to encrypt files in your network. Whereas a denial by default says, well, I don't recognize you, I'm not even going to let you run to begin with. So it's not a case of kind of trying to figure out, okay, well, I'm going to try and deal with this now that it started. It's saying I'm not even going to let it run to begin with. And I think that was one of the things that we were seeing in our practice. We were seeing live events happening in client sites. We were seeing early warning alerts of ransomware, of the guys setting up to inflict, the final part of the damage of ransomware in our client sites. And we were there, and once we looked through how they were getting in, we said we need something on the inside here to stop this happening, to stop it happening altogether. And that's where we came across ThreatLocker first. So Ben, the key functions of what your product does, without going madly technical,
Yes.
if there was 2 or 3 points you'd make just about what Threat Locker does, what would they be? Like, what would be, like, for people who know nothing out there really, just what would they be?
Yeah, so the best way to stop an attack is using default deny. That is just the best way to go ahead and stop any kind of execution, malware attack, etc. Now, the reason for that is a default deny is only going to allow certain applications that you have pre-approved. And by default, everything else is denied. That right there is application whitelisting. It's actually something I know we are based out of Ireland, UK, etc., Europe. But it's actually something the White House is pushing a global initiative for, is to essentially say everyone should be using zero trust. Default deny any applications that you do not know or have not pre-approved. So that is the first kind of key piece of zero trust as an architecture, but also Threat Locker, and we are a zero trust company.
Another point to make there. Anyone who's had to fill out a cyber liability insurance form in the last 6 to 8 months will have seen application whitelisting as the top priority on their technology list as well.
So application ring fencing. This is a fairly new piece that not a lot of people will necessarily think about. Now, it's great if I can stop an application from running. That's wonderful. But I'm going to have applications I need to be able to run, things like PowerShell. And by default, PowerShell can access all of your documents, so all of your files and folders. It can also access the internet, which is why a lot of threat actors will use PowerShell to be able to download ransomware from the internet and then execute it. So why not put a fence around that application? Why not limit what that application is allowed to access? So we've now gone from allowing certain apps to run to now allowing them to run, but being able to lock them down so that they can only work under certain parameters. Stop PowerShell from accessing your documents, stop it from accessing the internet, and again, shrink that attack vector.
Brilliant.
Down from there, we have elevation control. Very simply, we don't want users with local admin credentials. It's a total mess. Coming from a MSP myself, I recognize that we do need it. You have users who would have applications that they need to be able to run, and they have to run it as a local admin to be able to run this application. But what we can do here is we can essentially say, take everyone's local admin credentials away and allow them to be able to run it under their normal user account as a local administrator. They don't need to know the username and password, and it only elevates that one individual application. And then finally, storage control. This is my favorite bit of the whole solution. Essentially, USB blocking. Why do we need USBs to be allowed, for example? Or we can say only one USB is allowed to be able to run, or only this subset of USBs are allowed to be used based on their serial number. And then inside the storage control as well, we have also got our it's kind of file and folder or file path blocking is the best way to describe it. Backups. Mark, you mentioned backups earlier.
I think I got to say, I'm going to butt in here because this, in almost every, we get phone calls from clients. I've got a couple of professional services clients. They have clients themselves. They would ring us when they got a client who's been ransomware. Almost without exception, the backups get frapped at the same time.
Yes.
And part of what this does, well, I'll let Ben explain, but to be able to protect those localized backups, even if you have an offsite, even if you have a cloud-based backup, you got to remember that the costs of taking it back from the cloud back into your premise, the costs of that are huge. The disruption is huge. So preventing that is massive. And Ben, if you want to just explain how it works.
Yeah. I've got 2 scenarios that I'll bring up here. So one of the first things ransomware does when it gets onto a network is it scans for those CIFS, NFS, SMB shares, and it also looks for your backup location, as I mentioned earlier. Well, the reason, as I said earlier, is if it can encrypt that data, you're more likely going to go ahead and pay to be able to get data back. It's better for them. They get more money, blah, blah, blah. Well, why do I want any application on my network to be able to access my backup share, where my backups are stored, the backup location, which by default, any application on my machine that on my network is able to access, which is just terrifying. Why do I need Word to be able to access it? Why do I need PowerShell to be able to access it? And by extension, why do I need that ransomware executable to be able to access it? What we can do is we can say, hey, for this file path, your backup location, only allow access to your backup executable. That's it. So only the backup application can access that. If ransomware tries to get it, it hits an access denied. And the other thing to think about there is OneDrive as well. If anyone's using OneDrive and they've got the sync tool set up, that's an easy way for ransomware to get to the cloud, because ransomware will look for any files and folders and encrypt the data that's in them. As soon as it encrypts that data, it goes straight up to the cloud, overwrites the files, your data is then lost. Well, we can go ahead and we can put in some rules that say for your sync folder, only allow access to Word, PDF, VLC media player, etc. So that even then ransomware cannot access that. So those are just a couple of kind of scenarios to how the storage control can really help to protect data across your network as well.
Yeah, well, I could summarize it in a single word, which is beautiful. Because I can tell you from our perspective, we've been sleeping with one eye open for about 3 years, and we've been sleeping with both eyes open since the beginning of COVID. But really, since we've deployed ThreatLocker and it's not just ThreatLocker, it's the controls that we use through Microsoft as well. We're sleeping at night again. None of my guys are concerned anymore. But we just don't have that kind of wakefulness that we used to have. It's not that ThreatLocker is the answer. There's a whole load of things of the answer. And I'm also cognizant of time here. I want to give Dave the opportunity to talk a little bit about cloud, because a lot of what we're talking about here, is cloud the answer? So the reaction often when somebody gets ransomware, or they've heard of somebody down the way, or someone else has got ransomware, and is, okay, well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I've heard that Microsoft is really secure. In fact, did you not hear that last week they survived the second biggest DDoS attack of all time? But they assume, and of course Microsoft has all the controls and everything else, incredible infrastructure there to support that. But is it the answer? And I would say yes, but. So Dave, if you want to take over and talk us through my but. And
yeah, definitely. So there's definitely a few things for us to pause and think about. I suppose the reassuring thing, like you said there, Microsoft are a powerhouse in the respect that $1 billion annual investment into their security. So, you've got your red team and blue team that they spend there every month. Half of them are trying to hack into Microsoft, half of them are trying to defend, and they switch over. You can imagine what the bonuses are like over there. But there's a lot being built in, but. And this is one of the first. I think we're going to have 4 or 5, but the first. But yes, the platform has that built in by nature, but there's still wider responsibility. There's our endpoint. There's data when it's going between the Microsoft data center and our site. Are we encrypting it? A bit like some of the points Ben touched on. How are we going to address access and with users to folders? I like how you touched on OneDrive, because SharePoint and OneDrive, you can have challenges there around access. And I think, like Mark, you're saying, one of the issues is people can panic, and there can be that rush to the door. Right, let's get in there. Let's get on Exchange Online. We'll buy a Microsoft 365 license. We'll put a few bits and bobs in Azure, and away we go. And often you're actually better off taking a phased approach, taking your time a little, maybe as well, when you do it in stages. So I would probably start with Exchange and the 365 piece first. Let's look at device management and users before we then maybe look at depreciating infrastructure on premise and moving workloads into places like Azure. So it definitely doesn't have to be in one go. And also we can definitely rely on some of those tools to identify areas of focus.
So what I'm hearing that phased approach is the smart money, right? And I think what we see first and foremost is that kind of people often move their email first, and then they start moving elements of 365 and stuff. But I think regardless what comes to pass, you got a plan, right? And we've moved clients to the cloud, to Azure, Windows Virtual Desktop, Azure, all that stuff. But we started having these conversations with you guys about our training, with the training and everything else with our guys, and we talked to our clients about roadmap 2 years ago. And they're now moving 2 years later. But we moved the small bricks of pieces. We moved the identity piece up. We moved the file shares up into SharePoint and stuff, and use Teams and all that kind of stuff. But how do people go about preparing with a kind of with security in mind here? Like, if you're a punter, or if you're let's say you're relying on a managed services provider like us, or if you're relying on an internal IT team, what are the kind of questions you'd be asking your team, like, before you even start that journey?
That's a great question. I think also for it, an interesting point you're angling towards, point of reflection for customers. If you're working with maybe multiple partners, or you've come here as a prospect, and that isn't a dialogue that's being had, it's sometimes worth taking a step back and looking at, I know Mark and his team are very conscious of these things, but not everybody is. Some partners out there, it's all about getting the PO in, and there isn't that sort of conscientious discussion going on. And I agree, I think it is one of the most important things to be having that discussion, because the products are there, the marketing's there, but I think the approach is way more important than what we're using, with the sum of its parts. But with respect to what sort of tools and what the order of things, I think things like Sentinel as a SIEM tool that has AI and learning built in is very smart, because it can detect patterns of usage, and you can point tools like that towards on-prem workloads as well as multi-cloud. So maybe if you're doing some dev work and you might already be using another cloud, but you haven't moved productivity and apps away from premise into Microsoft yet, but it's on the roadmap, things like that could work very well for you. And even when you start putting things in Azure, there are fantastic things like Azure Monitor that will make recommendations. It will flag things that don't seem quite right, don't seem up to par. With Security Center, you can do really smart things, like you can filter the alerts and recommendations down to certain ISO certifications. I think that's awesome. So if you're trying to make sure you're meeting a certain industry spec, you can basically ensure that the voice nagging in your ear is tailored specifically towards that kind of rigorous compliance standards. So, and Mark, I don't know whether from your perspective as well with your team and your approach, because everybody does this differently. I've sort of shouted out a few product names there, but from your perspective, what's usually first? What do you guys start with?
Well, we normally start with the assessments first. So there's Azure assessments, there's the secure score in 365. So we'll often start there that just uncovers the obvious things. Yeah. And from an Azure perspective, I think that it goes way more than that, because it doesn't tell you about design flaws in your overall approach, but it does flag risks. So that there's a wide array of stuff to be done here. We don't want to make it sound hyper complicated, but if you plan first, and if you plan your resources in Azure as an example, or if you plan your migration to 365 and how you could be paying for licensing and only utilizing a fraction of it. So how do you get more out of it? How do you use Teams? How do you use SharePoint? How do you use the file shares? And as Ben was talking earlier on, they can protect a lot of this stuff. And then, like, once it's in place, how do you improve that score as time goes forward? That's the real kind of thing for us. It's not about getting it perfect in day one, but planning is critical, And I think the one thing that we'll wrap up on here in terms of what's going on out there, and I think COVID has really brought it home, right, is that people are working from all over the place, and that looks like it's going to stay that way. So that's one way of working that is new, but cloud is here to stay. There's no two ways about it. Cloud is part of the fabric of what we're going to be doing going forward. The risk and the risk exposure that we have today is totally different than it was 3-5 years ago. You couldn't have predicted how awful things have become for an awful, like how much of a target we all are now. Small business, the ROI on a small business attack is considerably higher than it is on an enterprise attack. So I think you need to understand from an attacker's perspective, small businesses are much better quarry than large businesses, because it's easier to get in and easier to get your payday quickly. So we need to think differently. And we need to redesign our networks and our approach to security, how we deliver stuff, and have a completely different approach to what you're doing going forward. And for that, like, it comes back to the basic model of assessing first, locking the stuff down with a very clear plan of what you're trying to protect, like not just layering up for the sake of it. And if you look at what Microsoft are doing, and what's available up there in terms of Azure and even 365, there is absolutely incredible controls available to anybody. You can just turn the stuff on, but you need to be guided through that process to turn it on. There's, I think, what Dave was talking about, that responsibility, and what Microsoft, I think, and what we describe it as is the shared responsibility. They will provide you with the platform and all the tools that you can use, but it's up to you to deploy them. And for that, you need expert advice.
Yeah. That's a really good point, actually, where Ben was talking about some of the high-profile stories we've heard in the past. And I think it's a good point to acknowledge with that shared responsibility model that a lot of public cloud providers, it mirrors, the approach is the same with all of them, that the platform is where their name, their credibility would be at stake, and you could pretty much guarantee that's a huge focus of theirs to make sure they don't have a breach like that. But it only extends to the platform, and therefore
it's your problem.
Yeah, there are so many stories that don't really make the news because it is a step away from that. But better believe they're happening. I guess there's one thing I'd like to say, though. You're quite right. It's a changing landscape, but with that comes opportunity. I think during the pandemic, one thing we've definitely seen working with a lot of partners and their customers is the ability to respond to some of this. So with furlough and things and less people in the business at any one time, you can reduce the number of 365 users, or we can reduce the spec of some of your, perhaps an Azure virtual machine, because your application has less interaction with it. I know it's not the focus of today, but I think it's also important we're aware of the benefit of taking the step, isn't it? Yeah, the benefit of making that move. It has to be a considered jump, but boy, once we've jumped, there are a lot of benefits and a lot to be gained.
Okay, I'm cognizant of time now, so I'm going to wrap up. And I think, as we were saying there, first of all, start with an assessment, even if it's rudimentary, even if you're going to align yourself with something like Cyber Essentials as a beginning point. Start somewhere, and leverage your managed service providers, or if you need some help, talk to us. Secure your technology, define the budget for an improvement program. And it's really important that budget comes into this. It can't just be, oh, brilliant, we need all these things. There needs to be a business case built to this stuff, because consider an hour of downtime. Consider that a ransomware infection, if you can recover from it, is likely to take your business out for 5 to 8 days. What does that look like in terms of your profitability, in terms of where you are, in terms of reputational damage, etc.? And seek advice. I mean, you don't have to commit to the person you seek advice from. You can seek advice and you can pay for advice. In fact, there's a lot of really good free advice out there, but seek it first. Always seek advice before you make that move. Always get a second opinion. I'm very, very, you would do it in almost every other part of your business. If you're taking financial advice, you could there kind of go, not quite sure about that, I'll get a second opinion. It's no different. And I think that just kind of wraps it up. I'd like to just say a quick thanks both to Dave and to Ben for their time today, and also everyone on the call. We're going to be sending a link out to this recording after, and you can feel free to call us. We're happy to spend an hour of our time talking to you. If you have any questions that spring out of this conversation, or if there's anything around cyber or cloud that you want to have a discussion with us about, we have absolutely no problem to pick up the call. I mean, like most of you guys on the call today are clients of Emidex, and Emidex are a client of ours, and we extend our goodwill through them to everyone out there. And my details are there, Mark Hurley. My email address is there. Danny will follow up with the link with you later on. I'm sorry for that blip in the middle, but my LinkedIn details are there. My phone number is there. And like I say, if there's anything that you want to discuss with us, whether it's from a zero trust perspective and you want to have a conversation with us via ThreatLocker, or with the guys in Westcoast who are been our partner for the longest time, and a really successful partnership at that, we'd be more than delighted to talk to you. But I think what we'll do is we'll wrap up there and just say thank you very much to everybody.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks everybody for jumping on.
Good chaps.
Thank you guys.